Welcome back to the History Bros. So, last night something very strange happened. I woke up in my Yale dorm room and there was this weird translucent figure in an old tweed jacket and he was mumbling weird things about the ancient economy.
It is I, Moses Finley. I am outraged. I drift through the halls of Yale only to discover a course claiming the ancient world had markets, growth, and even integrated economies. Utter nonsense. Have these people learned nothing?
Oh, Moses, everything's alright. We've been reading your work, a lot actually, but we also got some new evidence and I think you're going to find it really interesting. And today on the podcast, we're asking the question, did the ancient Mediterranean really have markets and long-distance trade that matter, or was it just embedded, status-driven economy Finley described? To help answer that, I've invited, the ghost of Finley himself, and a modern ancient economy scholar, Dr. Rhys Bentham. Dr. Bentham, would you please introduce yourself to the viewers?
Well, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Rhys Bentham, a Yale grad with a PhD in ancient history, specifically in the ancient economy, and I now teach the class Economics in Ancient Times. I spend way too much thinking about trade, shipwrecks, and imperial tax receipts, but I'm here to push back on Moses a little bit, to give a more modern view of the ancient economy, but respectfully.
Well, this is exciting. Moses, let's start with you. What's the basic picture you defended in your work, The Ancient Economy and War and Empire?
The essential point is simple here. Ancient economies were small scale and embedded socially and politically. Production centered on the household, not firms. Status and citizenship mattered more than profit. Long distance trade, yes, it existed, but it was thin, mostly luxuries and special goods, and did not integrate the whole economy. When I wrote about War and Empire, my argument was that conquest was a way for elites to extract land, tributes, and slaves, not a growth strategy. There was no capitalist spirit using markets to maximize profit in the modern sense.
And you were very skeptical of treating the Roman Empire or classical Greece as if they had something like a modern integrated market with a unified price system?
Exactly. When people talk about Greece or Rome as if they had some kind of modern integrated market, they're forgetting about how differently those societies actually worked. The attitudes we take for granted today, things like economic rationality or peaceful exchange, were, as the text puts it, demonstrably absent. And war really drives this home. Warfare wasn't a last resort or a careful economic calculation. It was simply part of how the ancient world operated. The prevailing ideologies accepted the naturalness of warfare both as one means of acquisition and as one way of achieving the other objective. Taking land, collecting tribute, settling political scores, that was all normal. Once you understand that mindset, it's clear why the ancient Mediterranean wasn't anything like a unified market. Their world ran on honor, rivalry, and political power, far more than on prices or economic integration.
Fascinating stuff, Finley. Okay, let's test that picture with some cases we read in class. First up, Ancient Assur. We read Klaus Wienhoff's chapter on Ancient Assur, the city, its traders, and its commercial network. Dr. Bentham, what would you say that evidence shows?
Well, to me, the old Assyrian material is very striking. In the early 2nd millennium BC, we see private merchants from Assur running long-distance trade to places like Kanish, a complex family trading firms, partnership contracts, loans with interest, and a whole commercial network anchored in Assur, but stretching all the way across Anatolia. On the tables, merchants talk in very concrete terms about profit, risk, and debt. All of this points to dense, profit-oriented, long-distance trade, with some features that resemble later capitalism and business practices. Even though it's still very clearly embedded in city institutions, family firms, and political framework of Assur rather than anything like a fully modern capitalist economy, it looks a lot less primitive than the old stereotype.
I never denied the existence of trade. There were always merchants, and they could be very clever. But these narrow elite networks that were focused on cities and palaces, this does not make the whole Assyrian economy a market economy.
But Venhoff shows that the city of Assur itself is closely tied to this long-distance commerce. Merchant families are a key part of the city's elite household pool capital and send caravans to places like Kanish. And trading agreements and disputes are recorded and enforced within Assur's legal and civic framework. This is clearly more than a few random traders sneaking luxuries around the edges. Long-distance trade is deliberate and important features of Assur's urban life.
So one thing newer work adds is how dense and organized some of these trading systems were, even in early 2nd millennium BCE?
Yes!
Interesting. Okay, now let's jump forward to the Greco-Roman world, where we spent some time on in class. Moses, you were skeptical that Rome had an integrated market. We've read work that complicates that, especially Professor Manning's The Open Sea and Terpstra's chapters on Mediterranean trade.
Right. Well, Manning does lay out the modern debate. On one side, there's a more primitive view like yours. On the other, there's modernists who think that the Roman world had something closer to integrated markets, with prices for grain and other goods that sometimes moved together across regions. Manning doesn't argue that Rome had modern capitalism. He really emphasizes connectivity, ports, shipping routes, tax, and fiscal systems that link Egypt and the Aegean and the Western Mediterranean. He also leans on archaeological evidence, like shipwrecks, amphora distributions, to show substantial, regular seaborne trade rather than just an occasional luxury run.
Archaeologists can show you movement of goods. It cannot tell you the social meaning or whether this trade reached the peasantry, rather than a thin band of urban elites and soldiers.
That's fair, but that is where Terpstra really complicates his picture. In his work on the Mediterranean trade, he shows that merchant communities, associations, and cities helped enforce these contracts and keep trust in trade, not by relying on some big modern commercial court, but through a mix of local institutions. Instead of no institutions, you get different ones: civic honors, reputation, and communal sanctions backed by city laws and shared norms. That's actually the kind of embeddedness you care about: economic relationships that are anchored in social and political structures. But it also suggests that trade was regular and important enough that people had to build real mechanisms to keep it running.
And then we read Peter Bang's Empire, Civilization, and Trade, the Roman Experience in World History. That pushed us to see Rome as a kind of tributary empire that both extracts resources and stimulates trade. What does this tell us, Doctor?
Exactly. It shows that the empire concentrates itself with wealth and creates a huge centers of demand, like Rome itself. Taxation and tribute being resources into imperial hands, and the demand that pulls in long-distance trade while including things like Egyptian grain and Indian Ocean luxuries. Again, it's not a free market, but a world where trade and markets are deeply shaped by imperial structures.
Right, and honestly, you're just reinforcing what I've been saying. Bang shows that Rome's economy wasn't running on market logic at all. The empire pulls in resources through taxation and tribute, piles them up in places like the capital, and that political muscle creates the demand traders respond to. So yes, you get trade, but it's trade driven by imperial power and not by an independent, self-regulated market. Economic life is still very much under the thumb of politics, which is exactly my point.
True, but your original picture sometimes made it look pretty marginal. The more recent work we've seen suggests that markets and long-distance exchange were structurally important to how the ancient empires operated and financed themselves, not just a decorative add-on for tiny elites.
Well, the case that really shocked some of us in the class was late antiquity. Peter's SARS on markets and the Edict of Maximum Prices issued by Diocletian around 301 CE. Moses, when you see an emperor trying to cap prices across the empire, what does that tell you?
It tells me that rulers feared profiteering and moral decay. Price edicts are about moral order, not about nurturing a competitive market.
But when you look at the edict assures, it sets maximum prices for well over 1,000 items: food, wine, raw materials, transport charges, and wages for different kinds of workers, including things like farm laborers and mule drivers. For Diocletian to worry about the excessive prices, he had to assume that people are buying and selling these goods and services across the empire, and that there are recognizable market prices that can spike in periods of inflation, and the state itself relies on those markets to provision the army and the bureaucracy. Cyrus argues that this is exactly what we should expect in late antiquity. The Roman state is deeply entangled with markets. It taxes in kind and coin, procures suppliers, and then intervenes in prices with measures like the edict. He thinks the recent focus on markets is useful corrective to order primitive views, but he also warns against flipping all the way to a fantasy of totally free markets. Markets are central to how the late Roman economy operates, where they're always shaped and constrained by imperial power and social structures.
So in a way, Cyrus is saying, yes, the economy is embedded in imperial politics, just as you argued, but this imperial system presupposes vibrant markets, the idea that there's two sides of the same coin.
I would accept that rulers had to deal with market phenomena, but again, they did so to maintain the fiscal and social order, not because they believed in market efficiency.
Okay. One last angle before we wrap up. We read Ian Morris on archaeology and living standards in Greek history. He uses things like house sizes, diet, and burial goods to argue that there were periods, what he calls efflorescences, where average living standards rose even if there was no modern continuous economic growth.
This matters because it suggests that the kinds of trade and markets we've been talking about were just elite games. In at least some periods and places, more people seem to have access to more stuff. Larger or better built homes, more varied diets, and a higher presence of imported goods in the archaeological record. That still doesn't mean the ancient world ever reached anything like modern living standards or sustained a modern style growth, but it does push us away from the idea of a totally static, unchanging economy where nothing ever improves.
I never argued that nothing changed. My objection was to the idea of a self-sustaining growth dynamic, like in modern capitalism. If your archaeologist friends shows some ups and downs in consumption, that is still a long way from an integrated market economy.
And I think that's roughly where a lot of modern historians end up. We still agree with you that there was no capitalist growth model in the ancient world, and that economic life stayed deeply embedded in status, citizenship, household, and empire. But we push back on how marginal you made markets and long-distance trade. The newer work, from old Assyrian merchants to Greek and Roman trading communities to the late Roman price controls, suggests that you might call empire-shaped markets. Real markets, real long-distance exchange, and real price movements, but always structured by imperial power and social hierarchy, rather than operating as a freestanding capitalist system.
So Moses, after hearing about Assur's merchants, Mediterranean trade networks, Diocletian's price edict, and archaeological evidence for rising living standards, are you still furious at our Yale class?
I remain suspicious of any talk of integrated markets and growth, but I will concede this much. You have shown me that empire and markets were more intertwined than I allowed. You have shown me that empire and markets were more intertwined than I allowed, and that new evidence, from cuneiform tablets to shipwrecks to legal texts, deserve to be taken seriously. If you insist on calling this an economy, at least promise me that you will keep it embedded in politics and society.
Deal. We will keep the embeddedness and add a bit more trade, credit, and price inflation that you are comfortable with.
Well, that wraps up all the time we have for today. Next time you hear someone say there were no real markets in the ancient world, or Rome was basically a capitalist economy, remember this. The truth is somewhere in between, shaped by empire, but also merchants, ships, and prices that even emperors couldn't fully control. A special thank you to our guests, Dr. Reese Bentham and the ghost of Moses Finley. Thanks for joining us today, and tune in to next week's History Bros episode as special guest Professor Manning joins us for an exciting discussion on the Dog Mosaic.